Welcome to ICC's event on learning more about Indigenous legal frameworks with Dr. Danielle Sarvestani, or PhD candidate Danielle Sarvestani. My name is Saman Tabasinejad. I'm one of the board members of the Iranian Canadian Congress. We're going to begin tonight with a land acknowledgement. I'm going to be using I'm going to be acknowledging the land that I am situated on in Toronto, but I'm going to share, sorry, I'm just trying to find the chat. I'm going to share a resource that others can use to find out the land they are situated on. For some reason, my chat box is not popping up. So I will share that in a bit when that happens, when I have access to it. So we want to begin by acknowledging that we are gathering today on the traditional territory of the Wendat, the Anishinaabe Nation, the Haudenosaunee, the Chippewa, and the Mississaugas of the New Credit First Nations, and that Toronto is home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. We also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13, signed with the Mississaugas of the Credit, and the Williams Treaty, signed with many Mississaugas and Chippewa bands. As we meet here today, let us renew and strengthen our commitment to reconciliation based on respect, partnership, and action to build a stronger, more resilient, and more equitable city. So I want to welcome everyone for joining us here today. And before we get started, we're going to give some background I will speak to some background as to why we think that it's important, why we're talking about Indigenous rights and Indigenous people's rights here today. And Arzu will speak about why it's important to our community to be in solidarity with Indigenous communities and nations in Canada and in the Americas and around the world. So we know that recently 215 bodies of Indigenous children were found just a couple of weeks ago at residential schools in Kamloops, British Columbia. But since then, hundreds more bodies have been found at other residential schools across the country. We know that the struggle for basic human rights in Canada and around the world for Indigenous nations and communities is ongoing. And there's a lot more, even as immigrants, that we need to do to be in solidarity and honor the original stewards of this land. So I do want to turn people's attention to a commission that perhaps not a lot of people were familiar with. In 2008, there was an officially established, the Canadian government, alongside mostly Indigenous groups, established the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and its purpose was to document the history and the lasting impacts of the residential school system on Indigenous families, children, students, and communities. This commission was completed in 2015. Hundreds of accounts of what the impact of residential school systems was documented, and it's open for everyone to read. And currently there are 94 calls to action to sort of right the wrongs of the past, and for the Canadian government and the public to take responsibility and accountability for the past, but also the ongoing present, so to change certain policies. I also quickly want to acknowledge that there are other, not just the residential school system, in which is a colonial legacy, but an ongoing colonial legacy, but other systems that that Indigenous communities and people face disproportionately. For instance, Indigenous women and girls are 5 times more likely to experience violence than any other population in Canada. And there's also a call to action on missing and murdered Indigenous girls and women and Two-Spirit people. All right, so I'm just going to pass it off to Arzu, who will speak a little bit more about this.
Thank you so much. Um, I want to reiterate the importance of this conversation that we're having tonight. And it's important because it never happened before. It seems strange to say, but it is new to any Canadian to know about the history and the culture, even knowing about the culture, but also the tragedies that the First Nations have lived. Some of our fellow Iranians may think that people who have been raised here, like me and Saman, for example, or even Danielle, have learned this in school. And perhaps they don't know, but we know. But it's really, they have to understand that it's new, that we all kind of are waking up to the reality of First Nations. Is that it's as if really they didn't exist, or they were almost extinguished. But they have been living here for 500 years and resisting a lot of difficulties, despite the difficulties. So just to say that people who have lived here for generations barely know anything and about the deep traumas that the First Nations have lived. The scandal of the residential schools has opened our hearts to finally look into this, to examine this and see how this can be repaired. This actually, the trauma seems to be actually ongoing since 500 years, but is really going on probably today. As Taman said, there is assassination of First Nation women almost every day, or every some minutes in Canada, and we don't even pay attention to that. It's as if it's not important. So just my personal experience is that I have worked as a physician in rotations in First Nation reserves. I have worked in the hospital receiving First Nations in the emergency room, but never understanding where did all this suffering from disease, mental health problems and physical health problems came, that which was much more severe than in the general population and even amongst the immigrant population. So that's why I think that it's important that we as citizens, no matter what origin we have, we really pay more attention and learn about this and finally put enough weight so that things change and we can live in harmony and even most than anything learn from the First Nation cultures that we have ignored and has a lot to teach us. So without further ado, I will let Daniel Sarvestani, an anthropologist and Indigenous rights advisor in Central America, give us a wonderful talk. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Arezou and Saman and the wonderful ICC board for organizing this really great event. As you know, we are currently, I guess we are very much into the Indigenous Peoples Month that is taking place right now in Canada. So it's an honor for me to be able to have this platform to talk about an issue that is really important and it's close to our heart here in Canada and across the Americas. So first of all, does my voice come through well? If I just get a yes, Arezou. Okay, great. I'm going to share my screen really quick, and then we can do the presentation. Okay. Okay, can everybody see this? My presentation? Excellent. Okay, so sometimes we have technical difficulties, but not today. So hopefully everything should be just fine. Okay, perfect. Okay, Ochin Meku or bienvenido. Welcome to our presentation. As you can see, we start the presentation with a depiction of what we call a medicine wheel over there. That's on the top right-hand corner behind an Indigenous woman dressed in her traditional clothes, clothing essentially, and holding a white feather. We have to understand that symbolism is an important factor when we work with indigenous people, indigenous nations, because stories are often passed down through images and symbols. So just to give you an idea, the medicine wheel behind her is the little circular object you see on the top right corner. This is a symbol that's repeated across cultures throughout the Americas, but also you see them also occurring among the Aborigines cultures in Australia, for example. And to many of these nations, the medicine wheel represents unity of the peoples across the world. So essentially, we're all humans and we all coexist in a circular manner. And there are other, of course, medicine wheel, there are other associations to it, but essentially that all nations work together in order to create healing for the planet. A symbol of women, again, for First Nations people in Canada, but also indigenous peoples across the Americas, women are carriers of culture. They transmit the ancestral traditions to the future generations. And in indigenous people's rights, often it is the women who are at the forefront of pushing the envelope for fundamental rights for indigenous communities, cultural rights. And the symbol of the feather here is to promote peace. The white plume represents peace, prosperity, and walking in the path of healing. So this is really informative for our talk, because this is essentially what these series of presentation or workshop are here to do, is to promote healing, promote community building, and promote a sense of truth and reconciliation. And this is a part of a series of workshops that maybe we can go through in the future. Nevertheless, we will start with a brief introduction to give everybody a general idea of what indigenous cultures are, who are indigenous people, and why it's important to fight for indigenous people's rights. So, like I said, there are some questions, essentially, why do we fight for indigenous people's rights? Why indigenous peoples in general? We have to understand that, when we talk about cultural diversity, especially within indigenous people's rights framework, you have to understand that indigenous peoples live in some of the world's most biodiverse or most ecologically rich environments in the world. These communities have lived within these ecosystems since time immemorial. For that same reason, destruction of these indigenous cultures also goes hand in hand with destruction of environment and sustainability. So in a lot of ways, as we are looking around us, we see ethnocide, we see the destructions of languages, not necessarily destructions, but also loss of languages, loss of cultural diversity, and we also see loss of environmental diversity, ecosystem, destructions of ecosystems. So in a lot of senses, loss of cultural diversity goes hand in hand with loss of sustainability, loss of ecosystems. And it's much more true when we look at indigenous peoples. Like I said, these indigenous communities, cultures have lived in these really rich ecosystems and biospheres. The decline of indigenous cultures equates the decline of their environments within which they lived in many instances. Second, we have to understand that promotion of indigenous people's rights also is really closely tied to promotions of biodiversity, promotions of environmental sustainability. We know, for instance, that across the Americas, in the Amazons, indigenous peoples were custodians of ecological diversity. They're custodians of ancient seeds. Therefore, working with indigenous people also goes hand in hand with helping to promote sustainability, biodiversity across the planet. Thirdly, in the Americas, or just even in Canada, there is centuries of discrimination, episodes of genocide, ethnocide, ethnocide being intentional destruction of a people's identity, culture, and sense of community, essentially. And indigenous people have had experience with this, and they have a history of decolonial movement that's really informative for us as a people here in Canada, but also for the immigrant community, for the Iranian community, for example, to learn from these struggles and to sort of take lessons from them, for our future generations. Again, I mentioned the issue of sustainability, history of social justice struggle. that we work with Indigenous nations, Indigenous leaders to this day to fight against issues of oppression, issues of degradation, environmental degradation. So it's really important for us as immigrant communities who have come to a new continent to reconnect, or to at least connect with Indigenous cultures, cultures who have been born out of the land of the Americas, and to convene with them and to learn from them, and to understand that this country is built on a First Nations heritage. And this could be informative for our own, let's say, decolonial processes, or for our own struggles when it comes to issues of racism, oppression, and imperialism, and other things which beyond the scope of this presentation. Nevertheless, we could go into them in the future. And lastly, of course, not the ultimate, or not the least, but lastly, the notion of healing collectively and individually. Of course, we're not just individual people. We live in community. And it's really important, as we will see when we're talking about Indigenous peoples, Indigenous rights, that we always not forgetting the individual, but also understanding, giving importance to the collective, to the connection and collection of people's ideas, communities, and culture. And we heal together, of course, by ignoring the genocide, the ethnocides that have devastated Indigenous peoples across the Americas. We can't get to a place of healing within ourselves, because we very much are still experiencing those traumas, or Indigenous peoples who are our neighbors, our brothers and sisters, are also experiencing those traumas. And it is part of our healing as a human people to acknowledge other people, other individuals suffering, other peoples or communities suffering, and to look within ourselves for healing as well, to heal collectively as a community alongside of Indigenous peoples. Okay, moving on. Arzu or anybody, please, if there is any questions or concerns, you could stop me and also ask for clarification as well. I know there's a lot of information, but just give me a thumbs up, Arzu, if I'm good to go, move on. Okay, great. We're moving on to the next chapter. Okay, so this is really important as a, before we begin, essentially, in discussions of what laws like special rights or specific rights for a people or a community is, it's really important to consider that these aren't really necessarily considered special rights. A lot of people always ask me, well, why Indigenous people? What makes them special? Aren't we all just human? Shouldn't we just have human rights? What's the point of having Indigenous people's rights? As if you're placing Indigenous people on a pedestal almost, and you're saying, well, these people have special rights, they're special, and everybody else don't have access to those rights. You have to understand this is not the intention of Indigenous people's rights. There are certain corrective instruments, corrective laws that we use in international law, just in legal doctrines in general. When a group of people have been oppressed for a certain amount of time, there is a necessity on part of the states or the governments or authorities to create a sense of justice by providing specific targeted laws to help equal the playing field, so to say. So it's not to say that we give Indigenous people special rights so that they have more rights than other people, but rather these are instruments to correct those historical injustices that mean placed upon Indigenous people, that give them essentially gives them tremendous disadvantage in society, in society in general. Therefore, these rights are to ensure that Indigenous people can enjoy the same amounts of rights, same human rights as you and I enjoy on a daily basis. Okay, great. Arzu, any questions?
Good. Perfect.
Okay. Great. So just give me a thumbs, because I don't have an eye on the chat. So if there's any questions, you can just let me know. We will go on. Great. It's also really important when we talk about Indigenous peoples, when we're working with Indigenous people, to understand that cultures are different. We might be thinking from a very Western-centric perspective in our discussions, in the way we see the world. But we have to understand when we're working with cultures, with people from different backgrounds, it's really important to be culturally sensitive. And therefore, I'm going to present here certain ideas, certain cultural notions that might be different from the traditional Western perspective. And these are really good to keep in mind whenever we are working with Indigenous people or promoting Indigenous people's rights. And this is just from my experience. You have to understand, across the world, there are Indigenous people that live around the world, and each culture is tremendously rich and tremendously diverse. Therefore, it's impossible for me to go over all of the different cultural variation. But this is, in my experience, some of the cultural variations that I've experienced in my years of working with Indigenous peoples in Central America and Canada. The first concept that really resonates with me and also resonates with a lot of Indigenous cultures is the idea that the idea of a living earth, Madre Tierra. In other words, the idea that the earth itself is a living being, it's endowed with spirit. So that's radically different from our traditional Western thinking that views the earth as an inanimate object, or let's just say a planet, essentially, a set of rocks or water or whatnot. These are objects and not necessarily considered as a living entity. But for many Indigenous tribes and culture, this very earth is living, breathing, and very much alive. And you are in commune with the earth in a constant basis. Secondly, many Indigenous cultures in the Americas put a lot more emphasis in relationality. In other words, rather than emphasizing the individual rights, right to privacy, right to ownership, and all these things, there is a lot more emphasis given to people's relations, communal relations. In other words, we live in a relational world, not just within ourselves, within individual and individual, but we have this relationality, this relationship with the living beings around us, not just with other human beings, but also other animal beings. Wolves, bears, moose, birds. All of these in many Indigenous cultures are important symbols, not only symbols, but they're totems. In other words, they're animated with spirit, ancestral spirit, and your relationship with these other beings and this community is essential. And if there's a breakage of this relationship, essentially the community doesn't work as a whole. Again, a lot more emphasis given on communal tradition, communal rights. A great example would be, for example, in the traditional Western perspective, there is this idea of individual right to territory. In other words, one person could own this land, own this territory. But for many Indigenous traditions, this concept of ownership isn't necessarily common or isn't necessarily known even. The land belongs to everybody, every human being, including every animal being, and no one person can claim ownership over the land. In the context of the First Nations here in Canada, in Ontario, even some of the Seneca tribes, Ojibwe tribes, there is this idea of generational stewardship. So there's 7-generation stewardship, and this is a really interesting concept. And this idea is a philosophy that suggests the land that I'm given to me, I have to, first of all, it is given to me from my 7 generations before me. So from my grandmother, great grandmother. And it is my responsibility to pass it to 7 generations ahead of me. So to my daughters. So in other words, this land, it does not belong to me. I'm only here to take care of this land as best as possible, to give it to the future generations in a state that could be passed down 7 generations. So this idea of taking care of the land rather than using the land for your own needs and whatnot is a really central, it's really key to working with many Indigenous peoples, many Indigenous cultures, and it's something to keep in mind. Again, this difference between stewardship versus ownership, whereas some people, you own the land, whereas other people, you steward the land. As a community, you steward the land. You're passing this land. It doesn't belong to anybody, but it belongs to future generations, and I'm passing it down in the state that I received it. So this may also conflict with a lot of our, let's say, modern sensibilities, but it's always really important to keep in mind we're working with tribal and Indigenous peoples. Therefore, in many of these cultures, there is the concept of an afterlife. People believe in a state of divine, or let's say God, or we call it the Great Spirit, and our connection to that Great Spirit is really important. So we might, in a Western tradition, we might really approach things with these scientific mindset, which has its benefits, atheistic, scientific, let's say. But when we're working with cultures, we have to understand with indigenous culture, there is this strong there is this relation. People relate a lot more to notions of an afterlife, to a life after this life, a notion of a god or a ancestor, ancestral spirit, or the Great Spirit. So this is important to keep in mind. And we also noticed that with a lot of the indigenous cultures, even you could look at the Bakhtiari or the nomadic people in Iran, their ways of being, their practices, is really closely rooted in the earth, in the planet, or in the area that they live within. For example, the texture, the colors that they use, it reflects the territory that they live in. Their culture, the way that they speak, is highly synchronized with the area, with the region within which they have lived for generations. So again, indigenous cultures are directly created out of their connections, out of their connectivity with the earth, which is another reason why working with indigenous people is essential if we want to try to fight issues like climate change, or face crisis, climate crisis, for example. In traditional knowledge or indigenous people's perspective is essential for us as in the modern world if we were going to face issues regarding climate or ecosystem loss. Great. Okay, so this is some of the cultural variation I've experienced in my own personal work with indigenous nations. You might have different ones. I would be very happy to hear them. But can I go on from this? Is there any questions? Arzu, you're good? Okay, great. We're going to move on. Okay, so this is a cosmovision. Let's talk about a bit of methodology. Now, I'm not going to go too much into detail with this. Again, this is a presentation that I use in the field myself when I'm working with government agencies and whatnot to help inform them about policies that they need to follow. But for our purposes, we're just going to focus on, how do we work with indigenous peoples or indigenous cultures in general. I can't emphasize enough before we even do any kind of a project. So if, let's say, as an Iranian person or as an immigrant, you'd like to go maybe help indigenous peoples and whatnot, which is all really great. But you have to understand before all of that, the most important aspect here, as I mentioned, relationality is really central to indigenous cultures, and we want to work within that framework. And the first step always is developing relationships. Harboring positive relationship is really important if you want to really connect with the community and develop projects that help promote diversity or help promote develop or sustainable development within these communities. And you have to always be sensitive towards the impacts of colonization and imperialism, because we know that these have caused deep-rooted traumas in the communities that we work with. Therefore, whenever you enter these communities, you have to, first of all, connect with the communities really closely and do your own research in terms of understanding the history of colonization, the impacts of imperialism on these cultures, and how it might have created a sense of trauma that's passed down through the generations. Unfortunately, for example, we see in Latin America, but also in Canada, there are great projects that are being, promoted. However, at the same time, there is nobody that's really taking steps to develop close relationships in the communities. For example, if I was helping promote truth and reconciliation, or peace and reconciliation, any of that, it doesn't make sense for me to develop a project when on one side I have police officers or the army entering in these communities and forcefully removing them from their territories, and on the other hand, claiming to be doing investigation and doing truth investigation regarding what happened in the past. In other words, heal those relationships now, worry about the projects and whatever in the second phase, in the investigation process. That's something that we must be aware of. It's not just about building, completing your objective, but it's also about building a personal relationship, not only with the community, but also with the land itself. It doesn't make much sense if you're destroying your land, the land that you have immigrated to, and at the same time claiming to be promoting indigenous people's rights. Okay, I'm gonna move on from this since this is a little technical, and we're gonna talk about a concept called the free prior informed consent, which is a legal term that we use when we're working in indigenous people's rights, but it could also be applied to all other kinds of areas of practice. For example, when we're working with the LGBTQ community, or when we're working with women who have experienced trauma, the idea of free prior and informed consent is really important. Basically, it gives indigenous peoples a fair assessment of the projects that are being developed in their territories, and also gives them an opportunity to fully participate in implementing these projects, which don't always really get respected. I'm going to share a video about the free prior informed consent, which I think will be important for everybody. Again, try to see how you might use free prior informed consent in your daily practices, for example, as a medical doctor. And I'm going to just open this. Can everybody see this? Arzu, can you give me an okay? Okay, great. Okay, so I'm going to play the video, and let me know if you can hear it or not.
Indigenous peoples. There are over 370 million, living in more than 90 countries, accounting for 5% of the world population, but constituting 15% of the poor. Indigenous peoples are custodians of native seeds, traditional knowledge, and biodiversity. FAO recognizes indigenous peoples as fundamental partners in development. The Food and Agricultural Organization, FAO, promotes the United Nations core principles and encourages the respect of human rights, including the right to self-determination in development. The FAO policy on indigenous and tribal peoples builds on this by calling for free, prior, and informed consent, FPIC. FPIC is a participatory process enabling indigenous peoples to have a say in interventions that may affect their lives. This means granting or denying consent, but only after receiving the information about the intervention, well in advance, in a culturally appropriate way, and prior to authorizing and starting any activity. Indigenous peoples collectively decide free of coercion, violence, and manipulation, knowing that if consent is given, it can also be withdrawn at any stage. Free, prior, and informed consent also enables indigenous peoples to participate and negotiate the conditions under which the intervention is designed, implemented, monitored, and evaluated. To facilitate a common approach to FPIC, FAO and its partners have designed a practical manual with 6 key steps to follow along the project cycle. Steps for ensuring that equal consideration is given to all members of the community. FAO training on FPIC comprises webinars and e-learning and face-to-face activities.
Okay. Okay, was everybody able to hear this, Arzu? I don't know if the video came through, or somebody could give me a thumbs up. Were you able to listen to the video? Okay, great. Yeah, I see a thumbs up. Okay, wonderful. Okay, essentially, in any kind of development project or any kind of cultural project you might have that deals with indigenous peoples or indigenous peoples' territories, you must approach this project through a free, prior, informed consent process. So this needs to be a formalized process whereby the community members all were given an equal opportunity to be explained what the projects are. They have to be given an opportunity to participate in even project design, And every step of the project must be done with the consent of the community. And you have to understand that if consent is once given, it could also be taken away. And once consent is taken away, those projects are to be stopped. Unfortunately, this sounds really wonderful on paper. However, the problem is in the implementation of this process. Oftentimes we see, for example, in Latin America, where a lot of Canadian mining companies are active, especially in places like Honduras where I've worked. The mining companies would come in, they would pretend like they have an informed consent process where they would go in, maybe they would visit certain elders, give them some money, get some papers signed, and then they would use this document to prove that they have done a free, prior, informed consent. However, you could see that this is not done in good faith. And good faith here means you have to show that you have put all efforts in order to engage the entire community and get their consent in a manner that is legal and transparent. There is lots of examples of how this is broken. This right to free, prior, informed consent is yes.
Were you saying yes to me? Okay, yeah, sorry. This is no, I didn't say anything. I was gonna just mention finish.
Please go ahead, someone.
Okay, so I just wanted to just quickly mention, just because while you were saying the explanation in Central America and how in Honduras the Canadian mining companies might not always follow the free, prior, informed consent. That's a really apt example, but we can also see it here in Canada.
Yes.
And I think Danielle and I spoke about it before, but with the Trans-Canadian pipeline, so there are a number of issues with like the pipelines that are going through British Columbia, where Indigenous nations, and just to be very clear, there is not even a treaty in British Columbia. Like this is completely unceded territory, and so these are Indigenous nations that are saying we don't want this pipeline, and that it's still ongoing. This pipeline still trying to be forced through, and then the RCMP are arresting what they would call them land defenders. I also want to quickly mention that in the chat there's a question about what the appropriate word is or term is to refer to Indigenous peoples in Canada. So Indigenous peoples, and maybe Danielle correct me if I'm wrong.
That's the question.
Yeah, but so Indigenous is all Indigenous people in the world.
Yes.
Right? And then in Canada that's like an umbrella term. And then there's First Nations, and that's the Haudenosaunee, the Chippewa, and quite a few other nations. Then there's the Inuit, which is the northern part of what's called Canada. And then there's Métis, which is those who have mixed ancestry between Indigenous and French, so the French colonies there. But please explain more specifically, and then each nation has their own name, obviously. But please explain more clearly.
Definitely, yeah. So in Canada, I guess the official term we use is the First Nations peoples, but of course, it's always really good to always ask the peoples or the community that you're working with what they prefer to be referred to. For example, the community that I work with in Honduras, they don't necessarily like to be called Indigenous. They would prefer to be called Maya Chorti by their name. Just like, say, us as Iranians, we don't like to be just called Easterners. That's a really general term, right? We would like to be referred to our own culture and our own set of ethnic beliefs and whatnot. So Iranian, that makes more sense to us, right? So you have to be sensitive about that. I know the terms and terminologies could carry quite a bit of politics behind them. For the purposes of this presentation, because the articles or the laws that I'll be talking about essentially covered under the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and the International Labour Organization Convention 169 on the rights of Indigenous peoples. the term indigenous peoples, indigenous persons, was kind of codified under international law. So that's the term we use to refer to those set of laws and practices that apply to the specific ethnic communities that we are talking about. And we will get to that, I guess, if we get time, if we have enough time, to what constitutes an indigenous person. This is we'll come to that term really soon. But again, essentially, it's really helpful to understand what the communities themselves like to be referred to, and always use that terminology. However, when we're referring to the rights of indigenous peoples, this is the name that I'm referring to those set of standards or rights that are codified internationally. Not necessarily to just say all people here are indigenous, or put that term on everybody here. Anyway, so yeah, there's the politics behind it, and I think Saman pointed to a really good issue. You mentioned the unceded territories. Just an explanation and a background on what that is. Essentially, unceded territories are territories that have never become part of a treaty with the Canadian government, or even also in the United States. These are territories that have remained, that were never essentially officially became part of Canada, but nevertheless, the Canadian government went ahead and incorporated them into the foundation of the Canadian state. However, in the history of Indigenous people struggle, those territories are very much still considered Indigenous people's territories. I think a huge percentage of British Columbia, for example, something like 70 to 80% of British Columbia, which is a huge province, actually constitutes unceded territories. So these are territories that belong to various the First Nations peoples. And the pipeline that Saman was referring to cuts directly across these unceded territories. And we saw not too long ago, there were a lot of protests, the land defenders, water defenders, they were trying to, stand against this unilateral, basically usurpation. You don't want to call it usurpation, but also exploitation of Indigenous people's territories, who are then forcefully evicted by military police and armed police, I think, yes, and the army itself too. In any case, yeah. So there's a really important. There is a lot of issues regarding free and prior informed consent that unfortunately don't ever get respected by various governments and authorities, not only in Canada, but across the Americas. Okay, Saman, can I get a thumbs up? Are we good to move on? Okay, great, wonderful. Generally, there's three basic rules. Whenever you do a project, involve the Indigenous communities, involve the leadership in all phases of the project development, whether it be a cultural project or a development project, economic project. You have to. Saman, everything okay?
Your voice was cut. Now it's okay.
Oh, okay, great, yeah. Second, base all your project activities on the notion of free, prior, informed consent. And third, develop capacity building within the Indigenous communities so that the communities themselves can carry out those projects, right? We see a lot of corporations, a lot of companies, they propose all these really wonderful activities of programs in Indigenous people's territories, but it's not done in good faith. Essentially, these companies, corporations, they go in and they provide this package and they themselves want to run it. Essentially, the aim of any Indigenous people's rights project is to have the community themselves take over this project and eventually internalize it as their own. That's the intent. Which doesn't always get respected, but anyways, we always try to move forward with this in mind. Okay, so I think let's just, I'm going to talk a little about the various set of issues that we here in Canada, we have come across, not only in Canada, but across the Americas. The various issues that we deal with on a daily basis when it comes to Indigenous people's rights. And there are certainly great many of them. And definitely I invite anybody who can correlate or has other examples, please chime in or please contribute and just raise your voice and please let us know. Okay, so with that in mind, let's go delve right into it. Okay, so in general, we have about 7 major issues that we're trying to tackle. The first one being land rights. Okay, like I was previously mentioning, for indigenous peoples. Actually, maybe I'm going to turn on my lights. 1 second. Okay. For indigenous peoples, land itself is really important, not only because it's a source of, is a site for resources to create, basic livelihood, but it also carries a tremendous symbolic value for indigenous nations. The existence of land, a communal land within which indigenous peoples can survive, is literally a space within which indigenous cultures can continue to exist. So once those communal land is taken away, symbolically that represents the death of the indigenous culture in a lot of respects. Second, because of indigenous people communal emphasis on the community, the notion of private territory just doesn't work with these cultures. So a lot of indigenous cultures, a lot of indigenous communities, First Nation peoples have always fought to maintain a space where community can take care of the land rather than the individual, and have always tried to fight against the policies, let's say settlement projects that have attempted to take away these communal territories and just redistribute them as individual private territory. So land, it becomes a really important, really vital epicenter of the struggle for indigenous people's rights, because within it there's a different philosophy, different approach to how we treat the land. Whereas one in the Western or let's say colonial narrative, the land is seen as a piece of resource that could be owned, that could be bought, that could be sold. Whereas for indigenous people, the land cannot be bought. The land represents a culture, represents a connection to the ancestors, it represents history. And we have some of those represented in our own culture, in the Iranian culture too, where the notion of land, let's say Iran Zamin or Arya Shah, for example, are really important to us. It's not, they don't just carry a capitalist value, but it also carries tremendous amount of symbolic, cultural, even spiritual value for a lot of these communities. So the destruction of territory, the loss of land, really equates to the loss of culture, the loss of people, a loss of a nation even. And we see this across the world as the colonial cultures, take away land and redistribute it as a private territory. Indigenous people suffer tremendously. Indigenous cultures are lost, and this is a epicenter or a focal point of clash between indigenous cultures and, let's say, colonial settler cultures. Was there any questions? Okay, great. So moving on. So first, I think one of the most important, land. We are fighting for communal territories, communal lands within which indigenous peoples can be preserved. Okay. Number 2, traditional occupations. For many indigenous communities, they have their own set of occupations that is, culturally relevant. They have their own set of practices that are important to them. And oftentimes with the advent of, let's say, the neoliberal economy, these occupations are lost. For example, in Canada, we have the traditional fisheries, hunting grounds, medicinal systems, traditional medicinal systems that are completely overwhelmed with the introduction of, let's say, the free market that basically dumps a whole lot of, vast amounts of goods from the global north, let's say Europe, North America, or China, into their communities. This actually kills their traditional occupation, destroys their traditional occupations. And we know, for example, the notion of traditional medicine. A lot of the times when we introduce Western medicine into these communities, the introduction of a lot of those drugs and whatnot actually overwhelm those traditional support systems, traditional medical systems that had already existed in those areas since time immemorial. And therefore, it's really important to incorporate traditional occupations within any kind of project or any kind of approach we have in the development process within indigenous territories. Always one of our fights has been to make sure that these small scale, for example, farming, pastoralism in Iran, for example, we have pastoralist cultures, right? Certain ways of life, certain ways of being that create, for example, shifting cultivation. These are rights for indigenous peoples to maintain their way of the traditional occupation and be able to pass it down to their future generations. So we have to be cognizant of that, of how modern economies actually end up destroying traditional occupations. And that's
just
something, yes.
Just in case
Summer?
some people might not be familiar, can you please define pastoralism? Just want to.
Of course. Yes. So for instance, in Iran, we have traditional indigenous communities, and Iranian culture has deep roots in traditional indigenous concepts, let's say. But certain communities who are nomadic tend to be nomadic. They tend to move with their flocks, so they could have sheep, goats, cows, even, and they would move from place to place depending on the season, right? So at certain season, so in Iran we call them yelag and summer pastures and the winter pastures, right? So in the summer, exactly, yelag. Therefore, they move with their flocks up north in a certain time, certain hour or a certain season. And actually, we realize that this helps preserve the environment because, of course, these traditions have evolved to be synchronized with the seasons even. So these people move to a certain other location to give that area time to rejuvenate, to grow again, and then come back, and then they repeat the process since time immemorial. And again, we see a loss of that as we introduce, let's say, there's big meat industries in these cultures. Of course, pastoralism doesn't make sense anymore, and people tend to lose those traditions, lose those cultures, which are all really important. Okay, does that clear what pastoralism is? Great, excellent. Okay, right. Let's move on. Okay. Of course, indigenous people tend to, here in Canada, even the First Nations peoples, they tend to have a lot more disproportional access to education, a lot less access to education as compared to the general population. Often the classrooms are, they don't have the resources, they're understaffed. The curriculum really lags behind. And actually, you have a exceedingly large amount of dropout rates in these school systems. Of course, because the schools don't really function. Same thing when across the Americas, within indigenous communities, this lack to a proper education creates a lot of other social problems. Of course, education is a fundamental human right. And it's one of the major areas where we try to promote indigenous people's rights. What we don't realize, one of the reasons that we have so much dropout rates, why maybe the education system doesn't work in these areas, is because the education that is being promoted is extremely Eurocentric or extremely westernized. In other words, it doesn't do enough to incorporate indigenous people's perspective, ideas, notions within the curriculum. So one of our priorities have always been to not only provide the sufficient resources, for example, sufficient teacher-student ratio, infrastructure and materials, but also create those cultural components within the education curriculum in order so that the education could become more viable, more even relevant to those communities. Therefore, we tend to see when we incorporate cultural let's say history of that in the certain people, or even teach the language, teach the programs using indigenous languages, actually success rates go through the roof. People don't tend to drop out as much. Of course, because it's part of their culture and they're embracing it, and it's a really powerful tool to incorporate those cultural elements within the education system. And we often see when we do, we tend to have a lot better results in terms of people graduating to higher education. Great, Saman, are we good?
Yeah, we're great. Just one question from the
Yes.
chat. We hear a lot about treaties in Canada with Indigenous peoples. Can you explain more about what these treaties mean and what they are?
Okay, all right. Yes, of course. So before Canada gained its independence, it was, of course, a colony of the United Kingdom or Britain. The Queen was the Queen or the King. They were the head of the state officially. So the treaties tend to be between various indigenous nations, various First Nations peoples, and the Crown. And in this case, the Crown really signifies the British Crown, basically, right? And these treaties go to develop the basis for treaty laws that create for example, in the United States, it's called the Indian Act. So these treaties inform a lot of our current laws that we have when dealing with Indigenous peoples or First Nations peoples in Canada. Essentially, in the common law system, laws are advanced through precedents. So these treaties basically create a precedence to show how to deal with or how to work with various communities, okay? So the basis of our treatment of Indigenous people or First Nations peoples in Canada is based on treaty laws from previous generations.
Yeah, and just to add,
yes.
So if I think Reza Namdari had put the native-land.ca in the chat, and if you go onto that website, it actually shows what treaties that you are occupying and what treaties,
That's
like
right.
for instance, Toronto is Treaty 13, and there are. And maybe some people know that there's I think it's 1492 Lamback Lane, in Peel. There's a lot of there's indigenous, like the Indigenous nation that's trying to take back their land, which is their land based on treaties. So a lot of these agreements that were made between the Crown and the treaty, the indigenous, the certain nations are not being upheld. So that's one way in which we can, as immigrants and as settler immigrants, we can understand a little bit more if we can read these treaties. And that resource that was shared in the chat is a really great one. Thank you, Daniel.
No, my pleasure. Yeah, for instance, as Saman said, a lot of these treaties are disregarded or just ignored, and it's really a shame. For example, in the case of the United States, they also have a lot of treaty laws. Unfortunately, vast majority of them were overlooked in for example, the occupation of the West. When the United States government was formed, they basically said, we don't agree with any of the treaties that the Indians made with the Crown, with the British Crown. Therefore, all those treaties are null and void. Therefore, we're going to go take over your land, basically. I mean, this is very general, but that's kind of that's one of the ways a lot of the treaties were disregarded, essentially. Okay, moving on. Discrimination, of course, we know that Indigenous people suffer from systematic discrimination, systematic racism. We know colonial settler cultures tend to have this antagonistic relationship with Indigenous peoples. And this has become part of the systems in throughout the state formation process throughout the Americas. So not just Canada, the United States, but also Latin America. Therefore, these underlying systematic discrimination that is, and when I talk about systematic discrimination, you have to understand there is a difference between discrimination and systematic discrimination. When something is systematic, it's become an inherent or integral part of a system, of social system, of an institution. And unfortunately, in the case of the Americas, these discriminations are institutional. They are part of the structures upon which the state itself was developed. Therefore, it's really important to have specialists examine these deeper causes of racism, deeper causes of discrimination against First Nations peoples, and determine policy to resolve them. And one of the best ways to disarm these discriminatory practices is to ratify international conventions. For example, elimination of all forms of violence against women, the Convention of Elimination of all forms of racial discrimination. In the case of Canada, for example, we've been trying to lobby the Canadian government to ratify the ILO Convention 169, which Canada hasn't done yet. And things like that, to promote general awareness. And in fact, what ICC doing right now is to provide that sense of awareness of these deeply rooted racial prejudices, these deeply rooted discriminatory practices, behavior, ways of thinking that we may ourselves not be aware of. So it's really important to have a certain person to bring these up to the front so that we can become aware of them and take steps to disarm them or address them. Great. I'm gonna move on. If anybody has any questions about systematic racism or discrimination, I'll be happy to answer them. Are we good, Saman? Okay, perfect. So we're just gonna move on. Okay. So one other focal point where Indigenous people's rights comes into play. This is a major issue. Is the issue of participation. In a lot of the development projects across the world, like I said, these are communities that live in really rich biodiverse areas. A lot of these development projects, even let's say environmental projects, they come into these areas and they just implement their projects without ever giving two thoughts about the people who live in those areas. Therefore, the notion of participation, as we mentioned, becomes really limited for Indigenous peoples. So in a lot of the projects that's been imposed on Indigenous communities, very little Indigenous participation actually takes place. So part of the free, prior, informed consent is to promote participation within these within Indigenous communities, and also working side by side by Indigenous people to create accountable institutions to help promote and protect fundamental rights for Indigenous peoples. Here in Canada, for example, we have the reservation systems. And as you know, lots of money goes to some of these reservation systems. However, because of lack of accountable institutions, actually, a lot of that money doesn't get invested in the most useful manner. And also, vast majority of these populations from these reservations don't get to participate in how that, let's say, that resource gets incorporated. Therefore, here in Canada, some of the reservations don't even have clean drinking water. They lack access to electricity at times. And to imagine that some of these reservations in a country like Canada can be compared to a third world nation is unforgivable. Therefore, it is always important for us here in Canada to fight for participation among Indigenous peoples, Indigenous communities, and to help provide a sense whereby Indigenous communities can work together to create accountable institutions, government systems, to help govern, to help govern themselves. Which is, I'm going to get into the notions of government in a little bit in future discussions, but essentially, to create a space within which Indigenous people can create promote fundamental rights for their children, for their families and whatnot. Okay, are we good with this? Excellent. So great. So we're going to move on, and let me see. Okay. The sixth issue that is a major issue here in Canada is access to justice. In Canada, we have something called the Highway of Tears, which refers to the continued, let's say, abuse, murder of and kidnapping of of First Nations women and girls. In the Highway of Tears, for example, to this day, women and girls of Indigenous descent or First Nation descent go missing. Okay, I'm getting some feedback here. Okay, no problem.
Now you're better. Now you're better.
Okay, great. Yeah.
Oh wait, now you cut out again. Are you speaking?
Yeah, no, I know. No, it's just because I'm getting a weird loop back in my voice, but that's okay. I can kind of continue. So in the Highway of Tears, for example, I think this is it's a great highway, and I think it's between in out west, the western provinces. To this day, a lot of women go missing on a regular basis. There are even accounts of RCMP officers abusing some of these women. There are Indigenous peoples in their communities who get assassinated on a regular basis. Their families killed, sometimes their children is kidnapped, without any repercussion. So this is what we mean by access to justice, so that a justice system can help protect these people and also bring to justice those people who continue to do harm to these communities. In places where I work, for example, in Honduras and in Guatemala, there are instances where the entire family of Indigenous communities are murdered and the cops don't do anything, essentially because they say, well, they're just Indigenous peoples. Their life, they are just violent in themselves, and this is just normal. So this normalization of violence in Indigenous communities is a byproduct of the colonial practice, of the colonization that continues to this day, and creating access to justice to promote mechanisms to uphold Indigenous people's rights in support of Indigenous institutions becomes an essential part of our fight to promote human rights among Indigenous communities here in Canada and also across the Americas. Great?
Yeah. Yes.
So we're going to move on.
And I did want to mention just one thing about the clean water that you had mentioned before, and how that is actually like known to be access to clean water in Indigenous nations. It's kind of a multi-pronged issue because it is the federal government's responsibility, and in 2015 the current government, so the Trudeau government, did commit to ending all water advisories, but also because of, like what you had mentioned, resource extraction and like certain kinds of oil spills. This has actually contaminated a lot of the drinking water that Indigenous nations and communities do rely on. I just want to add that.
Absolutely, and this ties really well to the healthcare issue. We know, for example, Indigenous peoples in Canada, but also across the Americas, they suffer from health complications a lot more disproportionately than the rest of the population. For example, in terms of diabetes, Indigenous peoples are a lot more at risk of suffering from diabetes. Depression rates are much higher among Indigenous communities. Acts of suicide, even that are related to mental health issues, are a lot higher. Even issues, a lot of different medical issues that are a lot more disproportionate and evident in Indigenous communities as it might be in the larger Canadian population. Therefore, a lot of our activities revolve around how to promote a healthcare system that maintain, first of all, that could provide an adequate sense of health for the Indigenous communities, but also incorporate traditional and holistic systems, Indigenous holistic systems within the traditional Western medical system here in Canada. For example, we know in many Indigenous and First Nations communities, there are institutions or even traditional medicine processes that first of all, that are a lot more culturally conducive to those communities. People tend to trust them more. We can use these traditional medicines within the healthcare system to provide a space where Indigenous peoples or First Nation can feel welcome in participating. I had mentioned before to my colleagues that, for example, there is a tremendous mistrust among Indigenous communities and First Nation people towards, let's say, the government of Canada's healthcare system, the government of Canada's police systems, right? And for good reason, because let's say this very same healthcare system have in the past attempted to sterilize indigenous women without their consent, so that they may not have so many children. That was the idea. They've also used indigenous communities, to run off, not necessarily just the Canadian healthcare system, but certainly certain companies. They use indigenous populations to as sort of guinea pigs, right? To test different drugs on them, and not only in Canada, but in South America and Central America, certainly these things happen. Therefore, a lot of First Nation people have this sense of a mistrust towards the traditional Western healthcare systems. It is really important, therefore, to incorporate traditional healthcare approaches that revolve around Indigenous people's traditional knowledge, that revolve around Indigenous people's occupations. For example, midwives are an important part of many Indigenous cultures that can be incorporated within the healthcare system, within Canadian reservation systems. Women play a tremendous role in many Indigenous and First Nation people in terms of collecting medicinal herbs, in terms of facilitating health for communities. Unfortunately, we also see with the colonization process, the traditionally male patriarchal dominated healthcare system actually destroyed a lot of these traditional occupations that were occupied by women themselves. Therefore, you take away those traditional occupations, the women value in the community also drops significantly as well. Therefore, we just coming to a conclusion that when we talk about healthcare, not only does we have to provide the adequate amount of access to health, but also we have to incorporate those cultural components that could be really important in promoting a sense of well-being in Indigenous communities. Okay.
Yeah. Can I just add one thing?
Yes, go ahead.
Oh yeah, sorry. I just wanted to add one thing. Just for folks who may not be familiar, that like the Senate recently came out just a couple of weeks ago that Indigenous women are still facing force and are coerced into sterilization. And I think last month in BC, Indigenous girls, like young 12-year-olds, were forced to have IUDs, which is an intrauterine thing. It's like, I don't know what it stands for.
Intrauterine device.
Yes, IUD, which is a form of contraception, and they're forced to have it at 12. So I did want to just mention that, and so it is kind of ongoing, and I'm sure maybe a couple summers ago or last summer, there was a young woman, Joyce Uchachin, in Quebec, who died after she Facebook Lived her interactions in the hospital. So just wanted to emphasize that.
Thank you very much. Yes, unfortunately, it does happen. It happens also the same in Latin American context. A lot of medical healthcare students, when they're about to graduate, a lot of them go to Latin America to, have this practicum with their colleagues and whatnot. And in fact, a lot of the people that they see tend to be Indigenous peoples. And they just test their medical skills on them. And unfortunately, sometimes with malintention. Anyways, I'm going to stop here. I think I'm going to open the floor to questioning. I just want to ask, should I stop here? Because in the next session, I was thinking of going into discussing the convention, the two documents that kind of lay the framework for Indigenous people's rights. And then this could be our second session. Because I think now it's 9:50, which I don't want to overwhelm people with too many information. So I'm just going to stop here. What do you think, Saman or Arazu? Is that okay?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it was very dense. It was dense. We need to digest and then have more, because
yes,
it's really very interesting and important. So I'm going to leave the floor for the questions.
Great. Thank you. Yeah, exactly. So we just kind of gave you a general background, like a really broad stroke of, struggles from Indigenous people's perspective In the next session, we'll delve into more details about the Convention 169 of the Labor Organization on Indigenous Peoples and the Declaration of Indigenous Peoples, UNDIR, essentially that's what's called. We'll go into details what these laws, what are these articles, and how do they address those concerns that we talked about, the seven concerns essentially that we talked about. All right, thank you.
Yeah, okay, thank you so much, Danielle. There's one question in the chat that I just want to read verbatim. So so the person asks, I just want to know how we can make sure these rights that we are talking about are the needs of Indigenous people and they're looking to get them. Apparently, we non-Indigenous have very different mindset. So how, if they have another request that we cannot think about, how are they involved in speaking out of their needs? So how I understand this question is like, how have they been involved in creating these free and certain kinds of calls to action or whatnot, which in just the Truth and Reconciliation Committee that it was led by Indigenous groups and nations. But Danielle, if you want to answer.
Right. So I'm just trying to read the question too a little bit. Okay. So one thing we have to understand that instead of our traditional way of approaching Indigenous people's struggle as simply viewing Indigenous people as victims, merely victims in the story of the colonization, doesn't do justice. It's not correct even. Indigenous people have always been played an active role in actively resisting the colonization process, the settlement process. They have led tremendous efforts in trying to establish Indigenous people's rights for their people, essentially rights to exist. And we as advocates, we drive inspiration from their struggles. So when it comes to the international conventions, let's say the Convention 169, in fact, it was the Indigenous peoples, the struggles that have led the international community to come up with these rights. For example, up until the 1950s, and this is something I'm going to talk about when I talk about the convention and the declaration, the idea was always that Indigenous peoples were going to disappear. In time, they were going to disappear and they're going to be integrated within this broader liberal context. They were going to be integrated within the state, within the Western state. However, came 1970, came 1980s, came 1990s, and comes today, Indigenous people have not gone away. Indigenous people continue to persist, they continue to resist, and they continue to be here, much like many Indigenous peoples around the world. However, we also noticed that even though the governments have tried to integrate these people within the state system, levels of poverty continue to rise. Level of lack of education continue to rise. So integration hasn't been the answer. Therefore, around 1980s and 1985, a lot of government agencies in collaboration with local organizations and Indigenous peoples came together in order to draft the Convention 169. And in 2007, with the help of Indigenous peoples, Indigenous leaders, the declaration was passed in 2007. So essentially, these two international frameworks were created in partnership with Indigenous peoples. Again, is a direct consequence of their grassroots struggles since time immemorial. If that makes sense.
For sure. Thank you for clarifying that. And all that to say is, like, for instance, just to kind of connect what you were saying about this project of integration, that was very much what like the residential school system was, or the sterilization processes. The idea was to take, like, quote, the Indian out of the child, or, to stop people from like having children, is because so much of what is considered to be like Canada's legitimacy relies on something called like terra like what's it called, like blank terrace, but it's like terra nuva, or this idea that that it's complete. There was no one here, when we know that there have always been people, like what you say, time immemorial. I also want to mention one other comment that I thought was pretty interesting. Someone had mentioned, I think there is a major problem for immigrants to be supportive of Indigenous people's rights because we have to comply with our oath upon taking our citizenship to have to swear or affirm that we will be faithful and bear true allegiance to the Queen of England. And I think this is interesting because, like, we think about, yeah, I would love to hear your thoughts, but when I thought I used to get into arguments all the time when I was in undergrad with people who thought that that was a normal thing to do, to bear allegiance to the Queen. But you know, if we think about how as immigrants we've been told to be thankful for a country that accepts us, and you know, we shouldn't make a fuss. We should just put our heads down, work hard, and we're just happy to be here. When in fact, like, what I like to think about is, okay, I am lucky to be here, but that privilege comes from as being a settler and the people's land and who where I am, like, settled in, right? So that's something to think about. And I don't know, Danielle, if you want to say anything about that.
But yeah, it's important to remember our privilege and then recognize that we are being privileged. And that recognize the pain and suffering upon who the pain and suffering that was caused as a result of the state that was created for us to benefit from, and which is really interesting with the comment about the Queen. The Queen or the office of the Queen or the royal family. They have a really peculiar relationship with the First Nations of Canada. In fact, the Commissioner General, I think, of Canada, who speaks on behalf of the Queen in the Canadian government, and is that the correct office? I might be butchering that, but right. Okay, thank you so much. The First Nations people now actually they tend to take their complaints to the office of the High Commissioner directly. In fact, during sometimes the royal or the Queen or the Commissioner, they tend to fight more for Indigenous people's rights than the government itself. So there's this relationship between the office of the Queen, let's say, and the government of Canada, because I think the office of the Queen or the High Commissioner, they were actually custodians of Indigenous First Nations peoples, so they were supposed to protect Indigenous peoples in the face of Canadian statehood, in a lot of senses. So it's not necessarily completely the fact that if you swear allegiance to the Queen, that means you must swear allegiance against Indigenous peoples. It's not so black and white, in my opinion. It's a lot more gray than you think. I think the Canadian state tends to disregard Indigenous people's rights, and in certain circumstances, the High Commissioner, who represents the Queen, tends to fight for Indigenous people's rights. So it's this adversarial system that's inherent in the Canadian legal process, that's also present when it comes to Indigenous people's rights. So in fact, when you're fighting for Indigenous people's rights, doesn't mean you're fighting against Canada. You're just helping promote fundamental rights for a sector of the populations who live in Canada, who should be entitled to the same rights as you and I.
Yeah, and I think the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and the calls to action really outline this, because what does reconciliation mean? It really means acknowledging what is happening and what has happened, and trying to rectify that. And I think that's really important. And in terms of this is just something that I've learned is all the treaties are treaties between nations to nation, like nations and the Crown. So then Canada sometimes as a nation of itself, like, says, okay, well, kind of uses that as an excuse, like, we're not the Crown, that's not our business right now. Yeah. I think that's the last question. And
great.
10 o'clock, and I do want to thank everyone. And I do want to just maybe say one other thing. Yesterday, MP of Nunavut, Mumalak Kakok, resigned. Not resigned, but she did resign, but she said that she was not going to run again. So she's a young Inuk woman. And there's a very interesting video, perhaps that we can try to share in the chat. And she talks about how she was elected to represent Nunavut, and yet, you know, Nunavut and a lot of the northern territories were actually only colonized like 75, 80 years, like officially, like that's when the occupation of the North really started. So she has, and you know, the suicide rates in the North are very high, and she felt like the Canadian government and being in that space was very, like, she couldn't do anything while she was in that space because there was no resources that were being directed to the North. And I thought that's a very interesting instance, because she kind of rejected even being a part of like what she would consider to be, or what is considered to be, like the colonial government, because there was no real truth and reconciliation happening with that. But I'm not sure if that video was put into the chat, but maybe it was. I don't have access to this chat, so I apologize.
I don't see it. Maybe.
But yeah, so that's all I wanted to share, because that's like relevant thing.
Also share that on the Facebook page for the event, so that people can have access to it.
Yeah, good call. Well, I do want to thank you, Danielle, for everything. This was really, really amazing, and it's such an amazing opportunity for all of us to learn more. Like Arzu said, I really only learned a little bit about Indigenous history, probably when I was in grade 5, about residential schools once, and then and so this is not a history that is, unfortunately, it's not being taught in Canadian schools. And so I know a lot, maybe some people are new immigrants who are here, and I didn't grow up in Canada, and they're, you know, I really did not know a lot of this stuff until I was old enough to kind of read books and be engaged, and listen to people like Danielle who are doing this kind of work. So I'm really thankful we've had this opportunity, and I hope that you all join us next time. He will go on to part 2.
Yeah, I'm just going to precise that the part 2 is going to be in 2 weeks, same time, Wednesday, 8:30, to go around the question. And that, you know, the interesting thing is that we just know the tip of the iceberg. That's the most scary thing, is that we think, oh, we're knowing, but we just don't know. And it's a very deep and interesting story, because it touches us, you know, in relation to all culture with modernity. And is this our destiny, but further in time? Are we going to be the next, you know, First Nations of this planet extinguishing slowly and hurtfully? So that's, I think I thank from the bottom of my heart Danielle for being here with us and giving us these precious information, and I'm very eager to listen to your talks in 2 weeks.
Me too.
Great. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you for
participating.
Oh, Danielle, did you want to say something?
No, just that. I just wanted to thank both of you, Arzu, Saman, and Reza, and the ICC board for this, for the platform. And I know you all are doing a great job raising awareness about these issues. So thank you as well.